Welcome to Module 3 of U.S. History 1302. This is going to cover chapters 20 and 21. First one is Progressive Era. This is going to be the period of U.S. history where we fix or attempt to fix all the problems of the Gilded Age. This is where we're going to address things like wealth inequality. At this point, the rich have never been richer. Many of their workers who have made them rich live in extreme poverty. Nearly all of these workers have extremely unsafe working conditions. There's no rules and regulations or anything like there is today. And it was very, very common for workers to be horribly injured, wounded, or even killed. There's also child labor, so it's unfortunate. It's not uncommon for even children to be horribly injured or killed while working. You also have no rules about apartment living, regulations about who can live in a place, how many can live in a place, how they have to be, if they have to have proper ventilation and things like that. And so when you have all of these people moving to the city and they need a place to live, there are apartment owners or slumlords, as they're called as well, who are willing to subdivide apartments and fit in as many people as possible. So they're very cramped. There's a lot of disease. There's not proper ventilation. People are getting very sick and ill and dying. There's also a lot of crime because, again, people are desperate. You also have a great deal of political corruption. There's people that are going to take advantage of the situation and convince these people that, hey, if you vote for my guy, if you give me your support, if you register for my party, then I will make your life better. I will make sure that your building has sewage or that you get a new road or that you get jobs and things like that. But they also were not against just flat out cheating and lying and bribing and stealing whatever they had to do in order to actually win an election. So in the progressive era, we're going to try to make things better with reform. So this is all about adding in new laws and new regulations, make it safer for people with their jobs, make it safer for people living in their homes. And so reforms can take several different um, form several different forms. You have, of course, laws. These are passed both at the federal, state, and local level. The cities, of course, take a lot of the lead in this, where they start to enforce regulations on especially things like fire safety, on access to ventilation. Many of these slums are condemned and destroyed, and then homes that are much safer and built to a proper code are built in their place. This is one of the reasons we call this the progressive era, is that many of the people who lead this fight are going to be called progressives. These are people who believe that we should use the power of the government to help make things better and try to stop human suffering as much as possible. One of the things that they're going to work to do is increase democratic participation. So, one of the biggest progressive movements during this period is going to be getting women the right to vote. And they're also going to be fighting to end child labor, fighting political but also business corruption, while also improving lives and working conditions. One of the big singular events that really changes things, especially in terms of fire safety, is going to be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This is just a factory in New York where there are a bunch of immigrant women in very cramped spaces making clothing. And they are in very, very tight spaces. When there is a fire, they try to escape and find that the doors are locked because management did not want them leaving or did not want people coming in to unionize them. And when this fire started, the management ran and left hundreds of immigrant women trapped in this factory. and many will try to escape by going to the roof. Some try to get onto a fire escape that was there, but it was not nearly big enough or strong enough to hold them, and so it will collapse. And so many women will jump to their death to avoid being burned. Some of them are on fire. It is just an absolutely brutal scene. There's bodies all around, and there's over 148 deaths, and almost all of them female immigrant workers and pretty young. So this will lead to a lot of new fire and safety regulations and rules, even though the actual managers and the owners of this business end up facing no jail time and have to pay very little to the families of those who were lost. So again, we are trying to fix and trying to make things better through government reform, through laws. In terms of increasing democratic participation, the biggest push is going to be women's suffrage. So, suffrage is going to be a word we don't really use anymore, but it was something that was really important, and it was described. We had universal black male suffrage and push after the Civil War with the 15th Amendment. And then in History 1301, we talked about the Seneca Falls Convention, where there was this first mention of women getting the right to vote and women's suffrage. And many who were fighting for suffrage at the time were also fighting for abolition of slavery, and they were not happy when black men got the right to vote, but women were excluded. And so there will be this push. Those who those who support suffrage, if you're a woman, you're a suffragette. And many of the first places that women were actually able to vote were the Western states. So as we are settling the West, it turns out that women are quite helpful at setting up these towns. There are, of course, going to be men that are doing a lot of the work. They're going to be the ones working in mines. They're going to be the ones laying the railroad and doing a lot of the backbreaking and heavy work. But it is the first women out in the West who sort of build up civilization as we know it. They're the ones who help create the towns. They're the ones who help build and bring civilization to the West. And so as these states increase in population and they eventually join the Union, they will join the Union with women having the right to vote. The ones who created the Wyoming Constitution, the leaders of Wyoming at the time, actually were quoted as saying, you know, we may wait 100 years to come into our union or come into the United States, but when we do, we will come in with our women because the federal government was like, well, you can come in, but you can't have women voting. And so they let them. They let the women have the right to vote. They weren't able to vote for president necessarily, but they were still able to vote on other things. And so most of these Western states will have very early, very progressive ideas, especially when it comes to women. And so by 1900, by the early 1900s, there is a much bigger push. There's a lot more organization, and there are different groups that are pushing for women to get the right to vote. And it will ultimately be given in 1919. The 19th Amendment will be passed, giving 19 million women the right to vote. Now, their first election that they'll get to vote in is 1920. And while it is, you know, obviously a step in the right direction, giving women the right to vote, the main push here is going to be white women. Some of these suffragettes, one of the reasons they were pushing for women to get the right to vote is to counter the new black vote. And of course, thanks to Jim Crow laws and poll taxes, literacy tests, and things like that, many black women will not be able to exercise their right to vote until the civil rights era in the 1960s. Many of these women will face heavy opposition. There are multiple instances of leaders being confined to mental institutions, being arrested. Susan B. Anthony, one of the original suffragettes, was arrested for attempting to register to vote. And it is actually, in a way, this treatment of women and these leaders that leads to the passage of the 19th Amendment, because it's seen as so brutal. How can we treat women like this just because they want to have a say in their government? And even though the word suffrage might sound a little bit like suffering, it actually has nothing to do with that. But it sure made a few good jokes, as you have with these anti suffrage cartoons and political cartoons and pamphlets that were passed around. Mommy's a suffragette, the baby crying. This person who says, "What I want to do with a suffragette," is obviously not very nice. These two are, I think, the funniest, in my opinion. Everybody works, but mother's a suffragette. I want to vote, but my wife won't let me. This idea that if, God forbid, we give women the right to vote, that suddenly men will have to be women, do what women do women's jobs. And then there's the other one where the second one, election day, mom, she has her ballot. She's about to go out to vote. Dad's stuck at home with the babies. And you have the husband and the daughter who do not look very happy at all. And the sign, of course, which is, what is a suffragette without a suffering household? So there was obviously a lot of opposition to this. And there are people that think that women shouldn't get the right to vote, or that they're not capable of it, they're not educated enough. But of course, at the same time, similar to what they were doing to African Americans at the time, is they're not allowing women to go to school. They're not allowing women to have the same level of education. And it all goes back to the people in charge wanting to keep their power and keep other people down. And it's easier to do that if less people have the right to vote. Another major change that'll come during this era is we have the beginning of our economic system that we have now. This sort of industrial capitalist system is really taking off by the 19 teens, 1920s. We have mass consumption. We have the first real consumer goods made on a large level. For most of our history, if you wanted something, you had to make it yourself, whether that's clothing or food or tools. If it's something really specific like shoes or tools, it might be made by a cobbler, someone who trains their whole life to be able to make shoes. For tools, blacksmiths, of course, would make both weapons and tools. And then we have this development of large scale factory systems powered by coal and steam. You also have the first department stores that sell things like clothing and linen, even cooking utensils made on a massive scale. And thanks to another new invention, credit, you have people being able to afford nicer and nicer things and have more abundance. You have this idea of buy now, pay later really hadn't existed in the past. These long term installment plans, today, it's not uncommon for, okay, I'm going to go buy a car and I'm going to spend the next 7 years paying it off. I'm going to go buy a house and spend the next 30 years paying it off. Or you get a cell phone and you're going to pay it off over the next 2 years. This stuff that is so common today was not existing, over 100 years ago. And so you have this new system and it allows people to start to buy these consumer goods, and that helps fund more factories that produce more consumer goods. And we go from very quickly, within a few decades, to a society where most people produce their own food, except for those living in the cities, which was not a very large population, to now the vast majority of our population lives in cities and nobody makes their own food. Nobody grows their own food. Very few people make their own clothes. And if they do make their own clothes, they certainly don't make their own fabric. They go buy it from a fabric store. And all this stuff is something that's only really existed for the last 100 years. And there was a really big push throughout the 20th century, this abundance, this American standard of living, where we have everything that we could ever need, and we have more food and more wealth and more prosperity than any point in history. And in a way, it will work. There will, of course, be massive amounts of inequality. There will be some people who can have more stuff than others. But very quickly, we go from, only the very, very rich being able to afford things like automobiles and appliances, the first refrigerators, the first toasters, the first electric ovens, the first washing machines, to now many families being able to do and afford these things, and also a rising middle class. And again, this term consumer good is this idea of these things that are created to ease burdens, and instead of having to make it all at home, and these are to be purchased by individuals, not by businesses. And this is a major shift in our economy, where we shift from a primary agrarian economy and an economy that's based on producing large scale things, to an economy where the consumption, where buying things becomes the primary driver of our economy. And that will define our economy of the 20th century. America becomes a consumption economy, a consumer economy. And one of the things that made this possible and made things even cheaper was the assembly line. This was a type of factory production that was pioneered by a man named Henry Ford. Uh, Basically, in the past, you would spend your entire life learning how to do something, again, as I mentioned, like a cobbler or a blacksmith, or an artisan who makes pottery or things like that. You would spend your entire life learning how to perfect your thing, and usually the stuff would be very expensive because it takes a lot of time for one person to do something like that. And of course, once you get it to an automobile, one person making an automobile from scratch, that automobile is going to be incredibly expensive. And if you look now, even today, where you have these large scale manufacturers, obviously the more cars that you make, the cheaper you can sell them for. This is what's known as economies of scale, um, which we've talked about before. But when you have the assembly line, you can produce a great deal more things and cheaper, because each worker, instead of producing an entire car, is only working on a small part of it. This person is going to put on the wheels. This person is going to attach the steering wheel. This person is going to bolt the engine onto the chassis. And instead of having to wait months or years or whatever to produce one good, you can have, one of these pumped out every few hours, and then every hour, and then every 30 minutes. And as that goes on, and as you're able to produce more and more, that becomes much more affordable for people to buy. Additionally, it also makes it a lot easier to train and replace workers. So, well, he just happened to get crushed by this car or this machine. Well, that sucks, but let's go get another worker to replace him. He'll be trained up in a day and ready to take his job. And this meant that you didn't have to pay workers very much, and that they were not very valuable. But that's one of the things that we have to deal with in the progressive era, and try to make things a little bit better, because, again, workers are not going to be the primary concern here, as the driver of everything, especially during this period, is the desire for profit and the desire for money. So the greatest example of this is the Model T, the car seen up there, as quoted by Henry Ford himself. You can have it in any color as long as it's black. Um, it was Henry Ford, of course, gives his name to the Ford Motor Company, which still exists today. He also will popularize things like a 40-hour work week, something that was almost unheard of at the time, where people would sometimes be working 12, 16-hour days, 6 days a week. He wanted to not only make sure that his workers had time off, that he also paid them enough to buy his car, to be able to spend money. And he saw what was coming. He saw this consumer economy. And when you have workers that can afford goods and can afford to buy things, everybody is better off, versus what we had at the height of the Gilded Age, which was most people having no money at all and working themselves to death, and sometimes entire families having to work themselves to death, versus having, a burgeoning middle class that is able to make money and spend money and do all that. And even though he will, popularize some ideas that are very important and help pioneer things like the assembly line, he's also kind of an interesting man. He believed that jazz was an attempt by the Jews to destroy American society, so he sponsored square dancing classes across the U.S., which was quite popular all the way up until the 1980s, I believe. He was also a vicious anti Semite, as you might have guessed when I said that he thought Jews were trying to destroy America with jazz music. And close friend of somebody we'll talk about in a few chapters, Adolf Hitler, um, who really took a lot of his anti Semitic ideas, but also his assembly line and applied it to the German economy, which helped make them incredibly strong and powerful and the second largest industrial power next to us. But we're jumping ahead there. As I said, there is going to be this push for unionization. We talked about unions in capital and labor. Uh, it'll get even worse in the progressive era, but there is this push with workers being getting into more union activity. Again, remember, every union is fighting for three main goals: more pay for their workers, less hours, safer working conditions. So we already talked about the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. It was founded by a man named Samuel Grompers, and it is a national union. So it is a union made up of other unions across the U.S. It is the largest union in the U.S. And at its height in the mid 20th century, it will have, I think, one in four workers will be part of the American Federation of Labor. At first, they only allowed skilled workers, but eventually will also allow unskilled workers, quote unquote, unskilled workers. Um, Unskilled workers is somebody who doesn't require a certification or a degree to do their job. And a lot of times, unskilled workers are looked at as lesser and they can be paid lesser and treated worse versus obviously a skilled worker because they're harder to replace. But one of the goals of unions, especially unions like the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, we talked about them as well, that was founded by Eugene Debs. They let in anybody, but they also, as the name says, wasn't just limited to the US. They were everybody. And many of them were a lot more leftist, a lot more radical than organizations like the American Federation of Labor. They even advocated for a eventually potentially communist overthrow of capitalism and creating a more socialist or communist utopia where everything is ruled by workers and we're a lot more equal. That's the big desire for communists, is to, instead of having a few people with all the money and the workers getting nothing or getting less, instead that it would be distributed more fairly and more equally. Although it will not really catch on in America for various reasons that we'll get into after World War One. So Module 4. In terms of political reform, in addition to women getting the right to vote, there's also this push for everybody else to get, especially more say at the local level. There's a greater push. We have what we call a representative democracy, where we vote on congressmen and senators and governors and mayors and presidents and everything to kind of run our country for us while we go about our lives. But there is a different kind of democracy, which is called direct democracy. This is where we actually vote on laws ourselves and we make decisions for ourselves. And so this will come in several different ways. A lot of this has to do with the political corruption at the time, this desire that maybe if we give more people a greater voice, then we can try to fight the corruption in our government. So the first one is going to be initiative. This is if you have a law that you want to pass, and perhaps maybe your state legislature or your local uh, municipal government won't pass it, you can get enough citizens together with to sign a petition that when you turn those signatures in, that law has to be added to a ballot. And this will start out in Oregon and eventually pass to other states as well. Then, once that gets added to the ballot and it is voted on, that is called a referendum. And so, if enough people vote on it and it passes, then it will become law without having to be passed by a state or a municipal legislature. The next is going to be recall. This is another way that we increase our say in the government. At the state and local level, say a politician is incredibly unpopular and you're not happy with them, then if you can get enough signatures together, you can actually basically have a do over election. And so this happened most recently. There was a recent recall attempt with the governor of California. And even though the recall was successful in terms of getting a second election, he won re-election and stayed in office. So it is a way to remove local officials, although, as always, the people in power do have. It is harder to remove somebody once they're in office than to stop them from getting in office from the first place. Another big change that'll come during this period is the 17th Amendment. This is one of the four progressive amendments that is in this module. And this one allows for the direct election of senators. So, again, we have two houses in our Congress. We have the Senate, which is at current 100 senators, two per state. And these are voted on by the people every 6 years. Originally, in the Constitution that was signed in 1789, it was the senators were picked by the state legislature. So, and for example, the Texas legislature in Austin would be picking our senators and not the voters. And this, again, is designed to give us more of a say in our government. And this is one of those things that's pulled from the populist platform, if you remember from the previous module, the Omaha platform, that gave us the direct election of senators. That was one of their big pushes. The other one, this one is specifically designed to fight the corruption of political bosses. Instead of them kind of picking whatever candidate they wanted, we would have primary elections and where you get to pick your candidate. Some states have caucuses, which are similar, but basically, this allows the people in that are registered to the party in the state in order to select their politicians. So every year before the actual main election in November, for senator, for House of Representatives, members of House of Representatives, for the president, there's always a primary or basically an election before the election where the internal party decides who's going to run, who's going to be the Democratic senator, or who's going to be the Democratic presidential candidate before the actual election. And this reduces the power of political machines. Like remember Boss Tweed in New York and Tammany Hall. Immigration continues to be a constant issue in our country. Obviously, there are going to be people who are pro immigrant, there's going to be people who are anti immigrant. It's especially interesting in a country that where unless you are 100% Native American, or you are 100% African slaves, descended from African slaves, then you are an immigrant or the descendant of an immigrant. And so there is this problem, as we sort of talked about before, because, well, these new immigrants are different. They're not like the other immigrants. They're not like my grandfather. They're not like me. They're not like us. They don't speak English, or God forbid, they're Jewish or Catholic. Can't have them in our country. We don't like Jews or Catholics in this country. We really have had a big issue with Catholics and Jews in this country, especially in the beginning. It was literally in Massachusetts. If you were not Protestant, if you were not a Puritan, you were kicked out of the colony, which is why eventually Rhode Island was founded. So this sort of anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic feeling has existed since our country was founded. And there's a reason why we've only ever had two Catholic presidents at time of recording. And so far, no Jewish presidents. There has been this anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish sentiment. There's also, of course, a great deal of anti-other immigrant of other religions that are not Protestant Christianity in our country. This is primarily focused, of course, on the immigrants coming from Europe. These are going to be Eastern Europe, places like Poland and the Balkans, Italy, and Ireland, people who do not speak English. And they're going to enter New York. This is the typical scene where we see there's the Statue of Liberty in a boat, and oh my God, we're coming to liberty and freedom. Oh, wait, now I'm going to wait in a very long line, be asked a bunch of terrible questions, um, and have a invasive medical exam. And then maybe they'll let me in the country, or maybe they'll put me on a boat and send me back across the ocean. Um, and also, if they don't like my name, they'll change it and make it sound more European or more English. So, immigrants coming from Europe are going to go through Ellis Island in New York. If you were coming from China, which is another, or Asia, which is another major group that was moving to America up until we stopped them with the Chinese Exclusion Act, they were coming in Angel Island, which is in San Francisco Bay. And of course, despite the fact that they are white and European, at the time there was not the same sort of distinction. They were not the right kind of white, so they still faced discrimination. Our next term is the temperance movement. This is a major movement during the late 1800s and early 1900s to ban alcohol. And this is a combination of two main groups who were pushing for this ban, Christian leaders and women's groups. And one of the reasons why that they were pushing for this is if many Christian leaders considered, alcohol a source of sin, that it caused men to cheat on their uh, wives and do lots of other things that they're not supposed to do. Many women saw alcohol as both something that was draining, obviously, family funds, uh, especially during a time when many people struggled to feed their family. Their husbands might go after a terrible day at the factory, their husband might want to go get drunk at the bar before he comes home, and they need that money to feed their families. And unfortunately, of course, sometimes the men would get drunk, cheat, and beat up their wives. And so many women's groups will push for temperance, along with these Christian leaders who saw alcohol as sort of the root of all evil. And there was definitely a lot of alcohol going on, and it was used as a way to cope with these terrible living conditions and with these terrible lives. And you also have, and this is also, as with everything else in America, mixed up with a lot of anti immigrant sentiment, since two of the major groups moving to America during this time are the Germans and the Irish, both considered fairly heavily drinking people, with the Irish and known for their whiskey and the Germans known for their beer. But of course, now we celebrate St. Patrick's Day and love our Irish whiskey. And then we have Oktoberfest uh, and drink German beer. And so, but at the time, this was a big push that we need to ban this. And of course, if we make it illegal, then people will stop drinking alcohol, and crime will stop, and people will stop cheating on their wives, and everything will be better. But of course, just because you ban something doesn't mean people won't do it. One of the groups that was leading this was the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. They were established in 1902. They started pushing for a national ban on alcohol. Many of them will start at the local level with what's known as a blue law, like laws that say you can't buy alcohol after a certain time, you can't buy alcohol or liquor on Sundays. Some places will even be declared dry counties or dry cities. So it's literally illegal to sell alcohol in these areas. And eventually they will gain enough support to actually lead to full prohibition, which is the 18th Amendment. So this happens just before, obviously, women get the right to vote. But as women are beginning to get the right to vote, beginning to across different states, this is becoming more popular. They're having more of a say in the government. there is this big push to ban alcohol. And so it starts on January 16th, 1920. The law is specifically targeting manufacturing, transportation, and sale. So basically, if you could afford it, you could buy a bunch of alcohol before the ban and then just drink that. And necessarily drinking it wasn't illegal, but trying to sell it, manufacturing, or transporting it would be. And so the U.S. has voted dry. The 16th state, again, if you have a constitutional amendment, has to both be passed by Congress and then ratified by the states. And once you get to a certain number of states, it's ratified. In this instance, the 36th state ratified it, and it became the law. Any alcohol that was not established or that was not sold by 1920 was disposed of. As you can see here, these men were pouring alcohol into the sewer, and this prohibition will last for 13 years, all the way until 1933, and it will not have the desired effect. And it will actually cause a lot more problems than it solves. And it did not stop people from drinking. Another thing that's happening during this period, again, we have a lot of growing of both influence of women and Christian groups in the country. Back in the late 19th and early 20th century, you do have this push to try to make things better. There is, of course, the ones who think that, well, let's ban alcohol and let's make things better. There's also another aspect of Christianity that focuses more on this, trying to help people, trying to feed the hungry, trying to help those in need. This is called the social gospel movement. They'll run things like soup kitchens to feed the hungry. You also have settlement houses, which are founded to help immigrants adapt to life in America. The most well-known one is the Hull House in Chicago, founded by a woman named Jane Addams, pictured on the bottom right. There, they taught immigrants English. They provided daycare for children, general education, also provided basic health care support service, helped them understand laws, get jobs, pay your taxes, and things like that. And again, this goes back to sort of this idea of Christian beliefs that we're called upon, that we Christians, people in the world, um, are supposed to help those in need, and they're supposed to try and make things better. And so they saw themselves um, as Christians. It was their duty to take care of those in need and to help those people. And the Gilded Age provided no shortage of problems and suffering. But as it turns out, private charity is not enough. We need something bigger. And in that instance, it's going to be the government. One of the ways we learn about the problems in our society is thanks to journalism. In this period, you have a group of journalists known as muckrakers. This idea being that they, you know, sort of they sort of peel back the nastiness. They rake the muck and show what's under it or what's behind it, and sort of expose the ills of society. We talked about the first muckraker we actually talked about was Ida B. Wells, who exposed the truth about lynching that led to the first anti-lynching laws. There will be several others that we'll talk about. The first one pictured here is Lincoln Steffens with the fantastic mustache. Wrote The Shame of Cities, which talked about corrupt political machines and that were in political governments. And he's considered to be the most well-known muckraker. I think Ida B. Wells was sort of added as later that she's kind of a muckraker, but the term really becomes popular thanks to Lincoln Steffens. So he'll help push for reform that leads to things like initiative, referendum recall, and primary elections and that sort of stuff to try to limit the power of political machines. Probably one of the more well-known muckrakers is going to be Jacob Riis. There is in the American Yawp, one of the primary sources that you could read is um, an excerpt from his book, which he talks about how terrible living conditions are in these tenements, those divided apartments I was talking about. It's called, the book is called How the Other Half Lives, which just showed these tiny, cramped apartments that were subdivided. And you sometimes have as many as 10 families put into an apartment that was originally meant for one because the slumlord that owned it just wanted to make as much money as possible. And many of these were poor immigrant families that really did not have a choice. They made it to America. They thought this was the land of opportunity, and oh god, it's terrible. I work a terrible job that I could die at any minute, and I come back home to a tiny apartment full of 10 families, and everybody's sick and dying. And like I said, crime and disease are rampant. And he will to go around and take pictures and interview families, and then this book will lead to some of the first laws governing conditions of renters and apartments and things like that. One muckraker that will actually take on the richest and most powerful man in the world at the time is a woman named Ida Tarbell. She takes on John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. At the time, Standard Oil is the largest oil company in the entire world. Rockefeller controls 92% of all oil production in the United States and is far and away the wealthiest man in the world and controls massive amount of money and power. And at the time, um, his wealth also was an incredibly large compared to the size of the American economy. Recently, the richest man in the world has surpassed what John D. Rockefeller's money would be worth today. But compared to the actual size of the economy and the amount of money that everybody else had, he's nowhere near close as wealthy and as influential as John D. Rockefeller was. And Rockefeller, like most robber barons of this time, will do lots of horrible things and destroy lots of lives and people's other businesses in order to become rich and powerful. That's how he controlled 92% of all oil production, is by putting all the other oil producers out of business. One of the people that he put out of business was Ida Tarbell's father, who had a small oil company, and he will drive her father out of business, and so she will write this big 19 part expose about all of the terrible practices and everything that Rockefeller had done. Ida's reporting will create such a public outcry that eventually Standard Oil is broken up and becomes several different companies, including companies like Exxon, Chevron, and BP today. So this is when we begin to try to correct some of the mistakes economically that we have allowed thanks to our laissez-faire policies. Again, remember we talked about laissez-faire before, this idea that the government should not regulate the economy, first popularized by Adam Smith in his book A Wealth of Nations. And it did lead to a lot of wealth and a lot of prosperity, just not for very many people. And what it led to was monopolization and consolidation, formation of trusts. And we go in a very, very short time from 4,000 companies down to just 257, where you have several hundred trusts controlling 40% of all US manufacturing. And the owners of these trusts and the CEOs and business leaders will just become incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful. And as they do, as rich people tend to do, they will use their wealth and power to exert political influence. And they will use their power as well to rig things in their favor and to increase their profits by getting rid of competition, by um, by treating workers terribly, by charging unfair practices, and by putting all the competition out of business. And again, Another example besides Standard Oil is Carnegie Steel. Both of these companies formed incredibly massive and powerful monopolies. As I said, Rockefeller did it by buying up all the competition. Carnegie did it by buying uh, everything involved in producing steel. He owned everything from the mines that took the iron out of the ground and the coal, to the ships that shipped to the factories that made it, to the railroads that took it to market in order to make it into bridges and skyscrapers. But there were also plenty of trusts in other company and other fields like meatpacking, railroad, telegraph that also hold an horsepower. We talked about how um, railroad monopolies were taking advantage of farmers and stuff like that, which led to um, many of them outcrying and calling for regulation in that. You have political cartoons like this one. This is not the first time we've seen men in top hats pictured with bags of money as their bodies. The title of this image is "The True Bosses of the Senate," which is again this idea that this area behind where the senators sit is supposed to be the public viewing area, a chance for us to kind of go see what our senators, what our leaders are doing. But of course, the ones who are actually controlling everything are the monopolists and the trusts. And then you have this very famous image of a giant octopus, the body of which is an oil drum that says, or an oil container that says Standard Oil on it. And you see him wrapping his tentacles around state houses, around Congress, and also reaching for the White House. And so there was this big push, especially among muckrakers, the media, and progressives, to regulate these businesses and regulate these owners and these trusts. And our president at the time, is the first progressive president. Again, Roosevelt will take over after McKinley is assassinated. He will become what is known as the trust buster. He will be the one who targets these and tries to regulate them heavily. He is not um, anti-business, and he's not even anti all trusts. He believes that some trusts are good and some trusts are bad, but they all need to be regulated. They all need to be limited in their power. There are still monopolies allowed even to this day. In fact, we have a level of monopolization that is probably just as bad, if not exceeding what happened in the Gilded Age. Some of them, like railroads and telephones and telegraphs, require incredible amount of investment, and so those are, in economics terms, called natural monopolies, where because of the investment that is made, because of the cost that goes into it, they're kind of allowed to be monopolies. There was a big issue in the last couple decades with cable companies um, having absolute monopolies over certain areas and dividing up the country basically between them. At this time, this would have been things like railroads and telegraphs and stuff like that. And so Roosevelt will target what he calls bad trusts and bad monopolies and will break them up. And as you can see from this cartoon, he has his Secretary of Commerce sort of squeezing the trusts. He's also going to be the first president to actively work with labor unions, and he that is because of stuff like this is one of the reasons why he's called the first of the progressive presidents. In his reelection campaign in 1904, he tries to offer what he calls Americans a square deal. In this instance, square meaning fair. He'll even call for an income tax, which again was not a thing until 1917, since the only income tax would have been either at a state or local level, but there was not a federal income tax because the federal government was funded by tariffs. And after his second term, because he'll win re-election in 1904, he decides not to run in 1908, and he ends up passing uh, his policies, his presidency, on to uh, Taft, um, who was our ambassador to Hawaii at the time. And he kind of expected Taft to just kind of carry on his policies. And as you can see from this cartoon, a lot of the countries just kind of considered him, a lot of the country kind of considered him under the control of Roosevelt in this Puck magazine, which was one of the major publications at the time. Literally, Taft is pictured wearing a maid's or a nanny outfit, and Roosevelt is leaving the White House and leaving his policies under his control. He will actually end up being not more progressive, but he will be a bigger trust buster than Roosevelt, but is usually overlooked in that state because he was not the first. And you have a few more. I love these cartoons of him. In this instance, you have him as a sheep and Teddy Roosevelt using the crook attached to a big stick because, of course, Teddy always has to have his big stick. That's the thing he's most known for is his big stick diplomacy. Um, in this instance, he's literally like a king and a successor. And Taft is actually not going to be the successor that Roosevelt wanted. He actually is a lot more conservative than Teddy Roosevelt. He's not as interested in unionization. He is not committed to conservation of land and resources. He also isn't that big into restricting child labor. Um, and so, even though he's supposed to be sort of his friend and handpicked successor, he does not continue on Teddy's legacy, and he actually quite they do not become friends. They do not stay friends. They actually are quite angry at each other, especially by the end of Taft's presidency. Under Taft, we will have the 16th Amendment, which is passed, which creates what's known as a graduated income tax. Again, the more money you make, the more money you're supposed to pay in taxes, although pretty much everybody knows that there's ways to get around that. We talked about that last time a little bit with philanthropy. If you or I give money to people in need or donate our time and resources, it's called charity. But if rich people do it, it's called philanthropy. They do it with a foundation that's named after them that they also control the money off of, and then they write it off on their taxes. So, of course, supposed to be more fair. It's supposed to mean that the rich provide more money, and then this is going to be one of the primary funders of a lot of these progressive programs and this new government regulation. As the government grows in size and is used to try to make things more fair, it is funded by these income taxes. And that'll really increase when we get to FDR and the New Deal. He will also break. Taft will also break with Roosevelt by getting rid of big stick diplomacy and replacing it with dollar diplomacy. Or instead of basically say do it we say or I'm going to send in the military, he's going to say why don't you do what we say and I'll give you a little bit of money. We'll invest in your economy or whatever. Um, but it is not very effective, as it turns out. And Taft is going to stray too far from what Roosevelt sort of expects of him. And Roosevelt, in addition to being um, definitely one of a once in a generation sort of leader, both inspiring but also very fair, a man of the people. He really is kind of one of the most successful early populists, where people like Bryan and others had, William Jennings Bryan and others had failed. He really succeeded. And he will do something that no other president, former president, has ever done or politician has done, um, which we'll talk about in a second. There is some other business regulation that comes in. We're gonna roll back this whole laissez-faire thing. Like, oh well, that didn't really work out. Let's do a little bit of. We need a little bit of government regulation. We need to make sure that they're not being too corrupt and too horrible. And so we have business regulation as our next term. This comes in several main forms. As I talked about, we have some trust busting with the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act gives the government the power to break up monopolies. Going back to the idea that competition is good. And if you have a monopoly or you have a trust, then you are restricting competition for your own benefit. And that's bad. You also have the Interstate Commerce Act. This is specifically targeting railroads at the time, again, because that's the way we move all of our resources. And this will try to prevent monopolies and regulate the railroad industry, which, as I said before, had been treating farmers very unfairly. Roosevelt will expand that with the Hepburn Act to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Act and calls for railroad rates. So, the amount of money that people pay to send goods on the railroads to be reasonable and just, although it doesn't exactly give them direct control. So, the government doesn't set the prices, but they can investigate and kind of force railroads to be more fair and just. One of the other major regulations comes after this book, known as The Jungle, comes out. This is probably the most famous muckraker. His name is Upton Sinclair. Sinclair was a socialist, and he saw the terrible working conditions, um, and really felt bad for the people. And of course, being a socialist, he wanted the government to regulate these businesses. He wanted the people, the workers, to get more rights and be treated more fairly. Um, what he chose to focus on was some immigrant workers working in a meat packing factory in Chicago. Now, this might be hard to believe, but at one time, there were no nutrition labels, there were no expiration dates, there were no rules about how food had to be handled. We now expect that the food we buy from a store or buy from a restaurant is safe to eat. And one of the reasons why is because it is backed up by the government. If a business uh, sells meat that is bad or food that is bad or poisoned or whatever, it'll be recalled. They could be fined. They can be shut down. They can be investigated by the government, that sort of thing. But that did not exist um, until this book came out. And so the book is known as The Jungle. And so in it, Upton Sinclair writes about how these people were basically being worked to death, and that they were dying early, and the conditions in these places were so incredibly awful. And again, he's hoping to pull on Americans' heartstrings and make them feel bad for these poor workers. But in describing the terrible conditions of the factories, he also focuses on the food. And this so disgusts and so grosses out basically the entire country that it leads to the first laws um, regulating food production and handling, and everybody focused on the grossness, because there's a lot of grossness in this book, which I always love to read. It's kind of I mean, just things that are unconscionable today. This idea of treating expired meat with different chemicals in order to cover up the stench. Because if you leave meat out, of course, and it's not properly refrigerated, then it would go bad. And so you would bleach it, or you would cover it in something, or like borax, which is used for today, it's used as a laundry detergent. Basically, using laundry detergent on ham and then trying to sell it to people. Um, And again, this was all because there was no rules, there was no regulations, and the meat packing industry just wanted to make as much money as possible. And so if the meat is expired, that means that they can't sell it for money. And in the words of Upton Sinclair, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach. And one of my favorite, I say favorite, I think what's one of the grossest um, passages from this book is talking about how ground meat was handled. And it was, he says in The Jungle, there would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and thousands of rats would race upon it. A man could run his hands over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. And he also talks about how the meat packers would put poison bread out for the rats. They would die, and then the rats, the meat, the dung, the poison bread, would all end up going into the hoppers together, where they would be ground up into ground meat and then served at lunch counters. And so, again, that's disgusting and completely unsanitary. He talked about how the water that's used for making sausages is where people would wash their hands after they went to the bathroom. How if a piece of meat fell onto the dirty floor that was covered in sawdust and mold and stuff would just be picked back up and put up back on the assembly line. How there would be sides of beef infected with tuberculosis, which is a deadly disease that can be transmitted to humans, would still be used as meat. And again, it was just so incredibly disgusting that it led to the first regulations on food. Um, so you have the first one, which is the Pure Food and Drug Act. This is what created what we know as the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which requires all ingredients listed on packaging. So if you're buying any product from a grocery store, it has to have an ingredients label, the nutrition labels. It also obviously has to be safe to eat, and and the FDA will prosecute anybody who mislabels or puts things in food and drugs that aren't supposed to be. They also will become the first to regulate medicine. There's obviously a lot of crazy stuff happening in medicine at this time, where oh, your child has a cough. Why don't here take this tonic that I made in my back room. It's made with heroin, morphine, cocaine. And sawdust, because there was no laws and there was no rules about what it is. But I'm sure that would take care of the cough and probably kill the child. But that's again why we need inspections, and that's why we need regulations. You also have the creation of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's inspections, where they check on meat, thanks to what's known as the Meat Inspection Act, which required that all meat that is slaughtered and processed must be done so in sanitary conditions, and they do inspect these meat packing plants. And one of the main ways that one of the main focuses of this was, again, like this idea that obviously if you're buying food for your family, you want it to be safe to eat. So there will be a big push for that. So all of that is thanks to this terrible book and everything like that. The fact that you can go to the grocery store and your food should be safe to eat. Um, Going back to our old friend Teddy Roosevelt, one of the things that he was really, really known for, in addition to being a progressive president, or one of his aspects of being a progressive president, was what's known as conservation and creating national parks. Teddy Roosevelt was an avid hunter and outdoorsman, and he saw that if you look at this map in the middle, that by the time he was president, vast majority of America's forests had been gone. 52% of our old growth forests had been cut down for homes, for trees, for whatever, and for burning for fuel. Almost the entire East Coast had pretty much had all of its virgin forests cut down. And there were places in California with redwoods that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. And as you can see pictured there, quite large trees, like some of the largest trees on the entire planet. And so he was very interested in protecting these, not only because obviously, yes, national parks are lovely to go visit and things like that, but also he wanted to make sure that our industrial capitalist economy didn't burn through all of America's resources without any sort of concern for the future. And his partner in this will be John Muir, also known as the father of the national parks. He was a naturalist, a botanist, zoologist, environmental philosopher. I have philosopher on there twice because he, stood in forests and thought a lot. He will co-found the Sierra Club and will push for the creation of Yosemite Park, which is one of the most well-known national parks in America. And again, it's this push that is looking for preventing extinction, destruction of habitats, and also making sure that we have these resources for the future, that um, hopefully we're having less of an effect on our environment than we were before. It's certainly another thing that will change during this period, thanks to all the coal and factories in cities. The cities will become nasty, disgusting places where the air is practically unbreathable. And so again, we'll try to make things better. Moving on, we have the 1912 presidential election. Again, Taft is supposed to be, according to Roosevelt, his successor who's supposed to continue on his policies. He did not do that. And Teddy was not happy about that. So he decided that he was going to run for president again for what would be his third term. And he could do this because there was actually no law that said you had to only have two terms. That was a norm set up by President George Washington, but there was not actually any rule that said a president could only serve for two terms. And so when Taft was up for reelection, Roosevelt originally tried to basically steal the nomination and become the Republican nominee again, but Taft ended up keeping his nomination. So Teddy will go and create what's known as the Progressive Party. He is going to again push this idea of creating this square deal, this trying to make things a little bit more fair. He will go up against Taft, and the Democratic candidate will be Woodrow Wilson. Now, remember, in the time since the Civil War, there has been only one other Democratic president. So from 1860 all the way until 1912, there has only been one other Democratic president. That was Grover Cleveland. All the others have been Republican. And so the Democrats had not had a majority in the House or the Senate. They had not had the presidency except for one guy. And so this is what happens with third parties, where they're going to end up basically messing things up for whatever party is the closest. Because as you can see from that map, Wilson will win the election. So Roosevelt, this is going to be one of the few elections where a third party candidate really comes in and affects things. And again, this is where Teddy is going to do something that no other third party candidate has ever done, which is actually get more votes than one of the main two parties. Our system is sort of set up as winner take all, and where there's really only going to ever be two main parties. Now, sometimes these parties fall apart and or come back. The Democratic Party was created after the original Democratic Republican Party split apart during Andrew Jackson's time. And then the Grand Old Party, the GOP, was created in the 1850s before the Civil War. And I don't know why they call themselves the Grand Old Party since the Democratic Party is actually older, but whatever. Um, it's always pretty much been them two since the 1850s. However, the party positions will change and they will go through different phases. Getting slightly off topic here, I apologize. Anyway, during that election, former President Roosevelt is going to give a speech where somebody walks up and shoots him and attempts to assassinate him. But President Roosevelt fortunately had a steel glasses case and a very large speech folded up in his pocket. And when the bullet will hit the steel glasses case and be stopped by the speech, and he will get up at that speech and basically say, please hold your applause. I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. So he's basically equating himself with a male moose, and so that ends up becoming the symbol of the Progressive Party. And he will give an 84-minute speech after being shot before going to the hospital. And so, very, very interesting, impressive individual. Um, his platform is going to continue this sort of idea of giving everybody a fair deal. He calls it the new nationalism. Heavy taxes on personal fortunes, continuing his progressive policies. Also wants to regulate big businesses and curb their abuses. Uh, Wilson, his platform is what's known as New Freedom. It's also antitrust and going to continue sort of this progressive ideals. He is the last of the progressive presidents. Also anti corporations. He is anti big government and pro small business. And while Taft is more focused on this Republican ideal of economic individualism, which goes through phases of being the popular thing. This will obviously work very well when the economy is doing good, but when the economy is not doing good, then we do end up sometimes wanting a little bit more government intervention. And Taft will lose badly. If you look at this map, you'll see that he only actually won 2 states, getting only 8 electoral votes, which is the lowest number of electoral votes for a person running for re-election. So an incumbent president has never gotten lower votes than that in terms of um, the electoral college. So Teddy Roosevelt will get the second in terms of both population and electoral votes, but because of the way that our party works, whoever gets the most votes in any state wins those votes. And so Wilson will become only the second Democratic president since the Civil War and the last of our three progressive presidents. And just for fun, you have some early interesting newspaper bits up at the top. As I said, the symbol for the Progressive Party is the bull moose. The symbol for the GOP, the Republican Party, has been the elephant for a long time. I don't know exactly when that started, but it is still that way today. And then the Democrats are represented by the donkey. And so this newspaper clipping, which is really cool, uh, photoshopped the basically very early version of photoshopped. Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, and Taft onto their respective animals, which is why you have Teddy Roosevelt riding a moose in that, which he did not do, and neither did Taft ride an elephant. But that's just a very early version of Photoshop. Despite the term progressive, there was one glaring exception among our progressive presidents and the progressive era, and that is going to be in the era of African American rights. As we talked about before, we'll have, of course, a sort of a segregated society. One society with rules for white people, one society with rules for black people, and everything, and especially in states like the South, will be designed to limit African Americans' access to things like voting. When you stop people from voting, it's what's known as disenfranchisement. So one of the many ways that black people were disenfranchised was through things like poll taxes, which required basically everybody but white people to pay poll taxes. They also included things like literacy tests, which are incredibly unfair. Many of these literacy tests were designed deliberately to be impossible to pass, but also just in case, it was also made where access to education was not, far from equal for especially African American children. And so it will do a lot of laws and rules and try to prevent black people from voting. But if that didn't work, then of course you'd always just have your local KKK or whatever stand outside and use intimidation to prevent them from voting. You also had white primaries, which is basically like, okay, so yay, now we get to pick our presidential candidates or we get to pick our senators, but only white people. And many state legislatures will pass laws and state constitutional amendments to try to restrict black voter registration and black voting. But how is that legal? The 15th Amendment is supposed to give black men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment is um, supposed to give women the right to vote. But this was just the way it was. And one of the main things that made this possible was what's known as the court case Plessy versus Ferguson. And we talked about this before again. They Supreme Court decided that segregation is not a violation of the 14th Amendment, and they created this doctrine which is known as separate but equal. The problem, of course, is that it was never equal. As the African American schools, hospitals, restaurants, everything was always worse. Always the leftovers, the hand me downs. In the South would be into basically hyper segregation, where the entire society, schools, hospitals, restaurants, workplaces, even drinking fountains and restrooms, had to have ones for white people and one for people of color. There's bans on interracial marriage. There's again this idea that the worst thing that could possibly happen is intermixing, where blacks and whites would marry and have children. And a lot of these laws are supposedly supposed to protect white women and excused for a lot of these things. And this will accelerate during the progressive era, and it will lead to, of course, incredibly unfair conditions. You'll have this ever widening gap between people of color and white populations, especially in places like the South. But there are people who tried to fight back. There are people who tried to make things better. These are two of our early civil rights leaders, ones that will have some impact, but also inspire future pushes for greater civil rights for African Americans, especially. The first one is Booker T. Washington. He was a former slave born in 1856, free during the Civil War. He will get an education and devote his life to providing education for his fellow former slaves and eventually their children. And Washington is a major advocate for what is known as a Black industrial education. He will end up founding what's known as the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1881. It is funded by philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie. And the main goal of this college is not necessarily like a traditional college. It's not going to be where you get a degree in art or a degree in music. This college is specifically to help you get a job and in what was known as vocational training. And he will popularize this as a major pathway for some people, and especially focusing on African Americans. Washington believed that basically, if African Americans bettered themselves, worked hard, and then eventually they would be given their freedom. And he lays this out in a speech given in Atlanta, which is known as the Atlanta Compromise, where basically he's saying, "Look, I know things are bad now. I know things are unequal, and there's all this segregation and discrimination. But if you work hard, if you get a job, and you get a vocational education, then eventually, if you just accept your place, then eventually white people will give you equality." And this was very popular, of course, when a bunch of rich white people are like, "Oh, this this African American man is telling African Americans to stop asking for equality. This is great." He will even dine with Vice President Vice President Teddy Roosevelt in 1901. This idea of a black man having dinner with the vice president is truly, amazing. But again, he was telling all the African Americans that they just need to work hard and get a job, and then eventually they'll earn their equality. Because apparently 400 years of free labor wasn't working hard enough. Um, so he will get, like I said, a lot of support from philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, and he will be incredibly influential in America at the time, especially among African Americans. But there are some who kind of saw this as obviously kind of counter to what they would expect. Again, America is all about supposedly liberty and freedom, justice for all, equality, that sort of thing. And this is very much not only refusing to fight for the unequal, but also putting the onus on the minority, putting the onus on the people who don't have rights, who don't have representation, to work hard to earn equality versus everyone who's born white, which is instantly given all the rights and privileges. So, sort of his opposite will be this man, W.B. Du Bois. He, unlike Washington, he will be born in the North and live in an integrated society. So he is not he's not going to he's not going to grow up in a sort of segregated existence like Washington did. So Washington was just kind of saying, this is how it was. This is how things are, and we just have to accept it. And then we have to work hard, and then eventually we'll get our equality. But Du Bois was the opposite. He grew up in an integrated community. He'll go to Harvard, America's foremost university, most prestigious, oldest. I don't know if it's the oldest. It's one of the oldest and most prestigious universities, and he'll be the first African American to get a doctorate, to get a PhD. And he is very much opposed to his Atlanta Compromise. In fact, he will argue that it's important for African Americans to get a traditional education, not just for a job, but to become better educated, to become more knowledgeable, and to get increased political representation. He wanted to make sure that that African Americans were demanding their equality now and not just kind of accepting things the way they are. And he will travel around the country, suing and fighting for equality across across the country, protesting things like lynchings or Jim Crow laws, and obviously discrimination in education was one of his biggest focuses. He'll end up getting a professorship at Atlanta University. He had one of his more controversial ideas, as I found out by talking to some of my fellow educators that are African American, was this idea of the talented tenth. He sort of believed that if 1/10 of Black men and women got an education and then married each other and had kids that also uh, went and got an education, that they could kind of raise up the entire African American race. Um, and so there was a lot of it, not to the level of like some cultures where you have uh prearranged marriages and that sort of thing, but there was definitely this upper society, this upper crust that's sort of supposed to raise everybody, which I did not know about until just a couple of years ago. um but one of his main legacies is the founding of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It was founded in 1909. Their goal is to ensure the political, educational, social, economic equality of all persons, and to eliminate race-based discrimination. That is their goal. It was founded by a group of other intellectuals, both white and black, including Ida B. Wells, fighting for African American rights, and they are still in existence to this day. The NAACP is still around today and is still arguing and advocating for greater equality for all people, as their goal has been stated. They've been fighting now for 100 years, over 100 years. So this is the last one for Progressive Era. So again, there are, as I said, sort of, there are some things that are progressive about the Progressive Era, but not all progressive. You might also remember from a previous one where we talked about the rebirth of the KKK, that Wilson was, despite being a progressive president, also a major racist. and had and showed the KKK film at the White House. Um, but again, we are trying to make things better. This is sort of the beginning of us using the government to regulate the economy and to provide more rights for people. The beginning of unionization becoming much more common, more accepted, and also more successful. We are beginning to get those things that the unionists have been fighting for. And it's really after World War One and the Great Depression that these things will finally be codified into law. But now we're going to move on to the next chapter of our module 3, World War One. So America has manifested its destiny. We're building a world empire, but we're still very much kind of only invested in ourselves, and we're not interested in what's going on the other side of the world. While the countries of Europe have also industrialized, also become incredibly powerful, and created these world empires that they have continued to build up over the last several hundred years. And now you're going to have a mixture of new industrial technology, old ideas, and old enemies that results in a greater level of death and destruction that the world had yet seen. So, as I said, our president at the time is Woodrow Wilson. He's the last of the progressive presidents, wins election in 1912. He does embrace greater government supervision of the economy. One of the big things that happens during his presidency is the creation of the Federal Reserve System, which controls the money supply. If you pull a dollar out of your pocket of any denomination, it will say at the top Federal Reserve note. That is because the dollars are controlled by our Federal Reserve. They are supposed to control the money and prevent inflation and things like that, and try to maintain the stability of our economy. Again, the 1800s, we went through a constant period of boom and bust. And now that we're trying to take more control of the government and hope that we can sort of stabilize our economy and provide growth without constant busts with varying levels of success. He will also sign the Clayton Antitrust Act, which gives the government even more power to break up monopolies. And it's also during this time that we create the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which is still operating today, that is supposed to provide consumer production and break up monopolies. Most recently, the FTC has been involved in several lawsuits with major companies like Apple and Google and Meta for being too monopolistic. You have Wilson's major goal for foreign policy is what he called moral diplomacy. So you had Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, Taft's failed dollar diplomacy. Now you're going to have moral diplomacy, which is basically if you reach his, what he determines to be a good country, if you're democratic and capitalist and generally mixed with U.S. Beliefs, then we will give aid, we will invest in you, and we will participate in trade with you. And if not, then we will use our economic power to hurt you. So, so that's moral diplomacy, but it will be far overshadowed by what's about to come in on the other side of the world. So, as I said, Europe has been going through a lot over the last few centuries. They've built up world empires. The map has changed a great deal. At the beginning of the 20th century, the map looks like this on the right. There is a new country called Germany. Believe it or not, Germany has only existed since 1871. So has Italy, not too much longer after that. These were previously broken apart um, countries. Germany was formerly the Holy Roman Empire before it was conquered and united by Napoleon, and then it broke apart again. Um, and in 1871, the Prussians, that's Prussia with a P, will conquer the rest of Germany, defeat France and Austria Hungary in a war, and become the unified German Empire. And suddenly, they are the largest and most powerful nation in Europe, with only Russia having a larger population. Um, they also will take a couple territories from the neighbor France, and that makes them very, very angry. And so France wants their territory back. Great Britain, which has spent the last several hundred years building up an empire across the entire world, which there's expression that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they controlled islands and countries all over the world, from New Zealand to Australia to India to places like Honduras and British Guyana in South America. And then you have France, which is supposedly one of the most powerful nations in the entire world and a large empire with a massive holdings in places like Africa and Asia. And suddenly Germany delivers a massive, embarrassing defeat to them in 1871. So they really don't like this new country of Germany. Horribly embarrassed them and stolen two of their territories in Alsace-Lorraine, which is this area that I've colored in blue on the far left. Britain has again spent the last several hundred years building up an empire, and now suddenly they realize, oh, there's some problems stirring on the continent. Maybe I should start paying attention because for most of its history, Britain had really not cared what happened at all on that continent. And then Russia, which was by far the largest in terms of land, they stretch all the way from Europe to the other side of Asia, down into the Middle East. But the Russian Empire was still basically a feudal empire. So this is um, a sort of a system that the rest of Europe left behind before the Renaissance. So hundreds of years in the past, Russia is still very, very backward. They have a huge population, but most of them are landless peasants known as serfs. The ruler of Russia, the Tsar, in this instance, Tsar Nicholas II, uh, is kind of like a medieval emperor, a medieval king. Technically, all the land control belongs to him. He is incredibly rich, incredibly powerful, and there are nobles, boyars, who live an incredibly prosperous, wonderful life and dance and party and have lots of fun. But the rest of Russia is so incredibly poor and so incredibly backward at a time when we've got airplanes and trains and cars, and Russia is just now beginning to build its very first factories, its very first railroads. So they are far, far behind. And now that France and Russia joined together because they're both afraid of Germany, now Germany's like, well, they have this massive population. And if they begin to industrialize and get weapons and things like that, they could be a major threat. And so you have all of these nations that don't like each other, that want to fight and are angry with each other for various reasons. They just need a spark, they just need a reason. And so that comes thanks to the collapsing Ottoman Empire. At one time, the Ottomans controlled major portions of southeastern Europe, modern day Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, Bosnia, Greece, all the way through to the borders of modern day Iran, Saudi Arabia, Northern Africa. It was absolutely a huge Muslim controlled empire, including modern day Israel, Palestine. But it was in decline. And so many of these countries, especially in Southeastern Europe, had broken away. And this area known as the Balkans had gone through several wars already. The Balkan states had fought first against the Ottomans to break away. Now they were fighting with each other to sort of to create their countries and create their borders. But at the same time, you have countries like Russia and Austria-Hungary going, "Hey, look at these new nations I can take advantage of and control." Austria-Hungary, as the name sort of suggests, is a combination of both Austrians, which is kind of German, and the Hungarians were the two largest groups, but they also had a bunch of other little nations. They kind of their empire in Europe was a combination of a bunch of other different ethnicities, um, with the Austrians at the top and the Hungarians sharing a deal of that power as well. And so they were keen to take as much of that control over that area as possible. But Russia, which has always kind of desired access to the Mediterranean Sea, they'd gone to war with the Ottoman Empire several times and lost. They, unfortunately for Russia, one of the things that's kind of as bad for them is, in addition to having um, a massive amount of territory, but kind of being not so industrialized, is the fact that for half of the year, all of the ports in the north of their country are frozen, and so they only have one. They only have one freshwater port, really. That's in modern day Crimea, which is in this sea on top of the Ottoman Empire. But they have to go through the Ottoman Empire, the Dardanelles, that area that connects Asia to Europe. Modern day today, it's known as Istanbul, and so they always wanted control of Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, and they were never able to take it. And so now that these countries are beginning to break away and the Ottoman Empire is weakening, they see these other nations as, hey, this is my chance. This is my chance to make it out into the Mediterranean. And so now you have Austria Hungary and Russia fighting over this territory in southeastern Europe. And that is uh, why the Balkans is considered the powder keg of Europe, because that barrel will catch fire and explode and lead us into war. Um, Back in America, as I said, we're kind of doing our own thing. And then our neighbor to the south, I did mention this previously. Mexico is going through a revolution. One of the revolutionaries, Pancho Villa, raids into New Mexico and Texas several times. Finally, Wilson says, hey, stop it. We're going to send our military after you. We send 10,000 men under General Blackjack Pershing to go uh, hunt him down, and it lasts from March of 1916 to February of 1917. We go 350 miles deep into Mexico, nearly getting to Mexico City, shooting up a bunch of Mexican villages until they tell us to get out. Um, we also capture the port of Veracruz to prevent weapons from making it to the Mexican revolutionaries. And even though we're not successful in getting Pancho Villa, this will be basically some training for our soldiers, which have had no other real fight since the Philippine American War and the Spanish American War, which Pershing is a veteran of. And when we talk about the causes of World War One, it's typically referred to as, obviously, because it works out very well, the main causes of World War One. So MAIN, and then the final spark. So the first one is militarism. So this is the belief that militaries should be used to achieve a nation's goals. So each of these countries, they have been building up and they have quite a large military because they have been conquering these world empires. Now they're going to use these militaries on on their European neighbors. And so all of these countries are training up and giving incredible power and resources to military generals who are coming up with plans. I'm like, okay, this is how we're going to invade France. Okay, this is how we're going to fight Germany. This is how we're going to attack Russia. And they all become convinced that it is through their military, not through negotiation, not through diplomacy or economic anything. It is specifically through military is how we're going to solve our problems. So of course, that leads to war. Um, and if you're going to go into a fight, it's probably a good idea to have friends. So they began to form alliances. As I mentioned, you had France and Russia were in alliance, and eventually Great Britain goes, "Oh, I should probably get involved too. Let me join with France and Russia." So that's what's known as the Triple Entente. They are all scared of Germany. You have the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. They are all kind of wanting to expand a little bit. Austria-Hungary, like I said, wants more control over southeastern Europe. Germany is afraid of France, does not like, or is afraid of Russia, does not like France, and so they're joining together. Germany and Austria also, of course, share a common culture, as they are both German, and so they're kind of joining together for mutual defenses. And then you have other allies like Serbia is kind of backed up by Russia, which is basically telling Austria-Hungary to, hey, if you try to take Serbia or do anything to Serbia, then we're gonna back them up and we're gonna go to war. And so what happens is that a fight between two countries suddenly explodes into a massive brawl between all these different countries. And so, what originally was meant for mutual defense eventually means that all these countries are going to be fighting. The next one is imperialism. Kind of as I mentioned, again, these countries are trying to take over weaker countries as they had across the world. Now they're doing so in Europe. This can be done through both economic and military means. And so, in this instance, Austria-Hungary will attempt to take over Serbia as they had taken over Bosnia and Herzegovina and others through their military. Now they're going to try to do that to Serbia, but because of the alliances, Russia's going to say, no, you can't. I'm going to protect them. And so that's what helps lead to this war. The last one is nationalism. This is kind of this idea that my country's better than your country, and kind of I'm willing to fight you about it. There's a lot of national pride and a lot of this idea that the state and the nation should be the same. So this is a big problem, especially in places like Austria-Hungary, which is made up of a bunch of different nationalities and a bunch of different what we would call nations and peoples. They want to have their own countries. They don't want to be part of an empire. And so there will be fights for independence. And that's ultimately what leads to the spark that ignites this dynamite. So the one of the main cultural groups in southeastern Europe is known as the Slavs. But even among the Slavs, there's different groups. And Serbia, which, as I said, was an ally of Russia, was one of the main targets for Austria-Hungary, as it was his neighbor, and they had conquered their cultural cousins, the Bosnians. They wanted to take control of Serbia as well, but the Serbians did not want to be part of Austria-Hungary. They also wanted to free. They also wanted to free the Bosnians, which were under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so they will create a terrorist group known as the Black Hand, and they will attack and do various terrorist things in order to try to their um, free their allies, their friends that are part of the empire, and they decide to assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, because Austria-Hungary is an empire, so you have an emperor, and then you have his successor, which is Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, Ferdinand will be visiting Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia. It is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There, his motorcade is attacked by members of the Black Hand. They throw a bomb in his car. It doesn't go off in time, and it actually blows up the car behind him. His driver speeds off and escapes. All of the terrorists scatter throughout the city. And unfortunately, the driver gets lost. And when he stops to pull over to get directions, one of the terrorists, the guy pictured up at the top, his name is Gavo Princip, is sitting in a cafe. Can't believe his luck. Hey, that's the guy I was trying to kill. Gets up, walks across the street, and kills the Archduke and his wife at point blank range. And so this is on June 28th, 1914. And this death is what's going to end up being that spark that ignites World War I. Austria um, blames Serbia for the assassination, for funding and providing resources to the Bosnian terrorists, which they did. Um, and so they basically give them an ultimatum: either you give up some of your sovereignty and you basically join our empire, or you be subject to our rule, or we're going to go to war with you and we're going to conquer you. And so Russia, being, Serbia's big ally, is like, actually, no, you won't, because if you try to do that, then we're going to go to war with you and we're going to protect our ally of Serbia. And then Germany, which is Austria's ally, is like, well, then I've got to back up my Austrian ally. So Germany promises a blank check of support to Austria, which they will seriously regret. And um, these generals are so stuck in their plans, so stuck in their ways. They're like, okay, I've gotta mobilize my army. I've got to get ready for this war. So I make this. I'm preparing for war with Austria-Hungary, but I have a war plan that's going to also involve the invasion of Germany. So I have to prepare for both. I can't just mobilize some of my army. I have to mobilize everything. Germany does the same thing. They're like, well, I have my plan to mobilize against Russia, but I also have this other plan to mobilize against their ally of France. So I'm going to begin mobilizing against them too, and so on and so forth. So again, you have all of these countries that begin arming and built, preparing for war, and really nobody who is wanting to stop this. You also have Great Britain, which, while they're not really mobilizing yet, they have promised to support the neutrality of Belgium, which is an ally of theirs. Belgium's a small country in Europe next to France and across the English Channel from Great Britain. And so you have all of these countries and all their allies getting ready for war, building up their armies. Everybody's ready to go. So you have all these countries that have mobilized, that they're preparing for war. The alliances have drawn the lines, and we're about to have this massive conflagration. And it starts on July 28th, 1914. Serbia rejects the ultimatum. Austria-Hungary declares war. And then Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st, and then France on August 3rd. And so Germany invades Belgium, which was not even part of the alliance. But again, it goes back to this military plans. These generals who had all this power and basically were allowed to run things were like, well, if we try to attack France directly on our border with France, well, they're gonna suspect that. So I'm gonna go around the back. I'm gonna go through Belgium, which is gonna be a lot easier. And then we're gonna sweep through. We're gonna take Paris, and France will be out of the war because Paris being is the capital of France, so obviously that's where the government is. But also, in terms of like French history, Paris is absolutely massively important. It is not only the government center, but it is also the cultural center, the economic center, the academic center. It is everything to France. Without Paris, France basically, I don't want to say doesn't exist, but it would be such a crushing defeat that basically they believed that if they took Paris, France would give up. And they could be right, since that's basically what happens during the Second World War. Spoiler alert. Um, so Britain will declare war and join after Germany invades neutral Belgium. Their goal, this plan was created by the head German general known as von Schlieffen. And the Schlieffen plan, as I said, was to take out France by sweeping through Belgium, taking Paris, ending the war, ending that fight quickly, so then they could focus on Russia. Well, his plan fails, and then Japan ends up declaring war on Germany and taking some of their colonies on August 25th, and then Italy will switch sides. Italy is not a good ally in either world war, as it turns out, and declares war on Austria, Germany, and then their new ally of the Ottoman Empire. Because Italy, even though they had been an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary, supposedly they actually really wanted territory from Austria. Although, as it turns out, they aren't actually a good ally, not only because they switch sides, but also because they don't actually win any battles. Um, and then you have Bulgaria is the final member of what we call the Central Powers to join with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. So you have the Allies versus the Central Powers. So France, Britain, Russia, Serbia, Japan, and then eventually others will join. And then you have the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. And so it already looks like they're massively outnumbered, but it turns out that the Germans are pretty good at fighting, and they have a massive industrial economy and a pretty good sized population. And so, despite being outnumbered, they will actually do quite well, especially against the Russians. Now in America, we're like, this isn't our problem. We're not going to get involved. Y'all can, y'all can fight your war over there. We will, however, sell you weapons because we like money and war is good for business. Um, the U.S. will be declared neutral August 4th, 1914. However, we will begin trading weapons. Although we do have even though we are neutral, we do kind of have our favorites. We end up selling throughout the war a lot more weapons to France and Britain, especially. We do have this shared history. Britain is one of our closest allies, biggest trading partners. Also, of course, we have a shared cultural history. But also, the British have the largest navy in the world at the time, and they will blockade all of German ports. So even if we wanted to trade with Germany, we can't get to their ports thanks to the British Navy. Um, and so the Germans will respond with a U-boat, which will be very important later, a submarine or underwater boat. And Wilson will call for freedom of the seas and wanting to make the world safe for the world needs to be safe for democracy. Wilson, again, going back to his sort of moral, progressive ideas, um, will be his sort of main push, but he is not going to get us involved in this war and he is going to keep us out of it. Even though it starts off really violently, really quickly. You have all these new weapons. You have machine guns. You have new rifles. You have massive artillery. Very, very quickly, we realize that the old ways of fighting the war are no longer exist. Um, the old way of fighting a war is you have two armies wearing probably very colorful clothing, lining up across a field from each other, and then taking turns shooting at each other, and then eventually one leaves. But if you line up in a field across from somebody with a machine gun, they can just kind of take you all out. So very, very quickly they realized, oh, we need some protection from these machine guns, and they dug trenches. And so you get what's known as trench warfare. After the Schlieffen Plan fails, both sides will dig trenches about 30 miles from Paris. So it was almost successful, but the French were able to stop them at the last minute. And both sides will dig incredibly intricate trench systems designed to protect against attack. And they will be so incredibly well made that neither side is able to take them or advance. And this is what's known as a stalemate. Neither side is able to win. This is a chess term. Put up they dig down, they put in sandbags, they also do a bunch of barbed wire, mines, and this area in between the trenches, the Allied trenches and the German trenches, becomes what's known as no man's land, basically because no man can stand there long because you'll either step on a mine, get trapped in barbed wire, or shot by a machine gun, or killed by artillery or some other horrible, terrible thing. And this will lead to 4 years of absolute slaughter as both sides send millions to their deaths, trying to conquer and trying to break this stalemate that is not successful. You also have some wonderful things like trench foot, because if you dig down into the dirt, then you're going to eventually hit mud. And it turns out that if you're a soldier and you're standing in water for a long time, or you don't change your socks or boots very often, or your feet are wet for a while, you get lovely growths of fungus and other wonderful things that cause you to lose your feet. And so this leads to what's known as trench foot, which means your feet have to be amputated as the skin just kind of molts and falls off. Or, you might get woken up in the middle of the night and a rat's eating the dead skin off your feet or toes and things like that. So it's just generally awful. It turns out the Germans were much better at this and they didn't have this problem. Just the British and the French um, didn't didn't know how to prevent flooding or build very intricate trenches, while the Germans did. So they'll suffer terrible things like trench foot. You also have new weapons. You have machine guns. As I said, again, obviously, I think everybody knows what a machine gun is. Just instead of firing one bullet at a time, you fire lots of bullets very, very quickly, and you can kill a lot more people. And so I described it with incredibly academic terms of bang, 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 bang. You also have poison gas, because it was believed that, well, we've got to clear out the trenches some way. So if we lob poison gas in, then the soldiers will scatter, and then we can take that trench. They'll use things like mustard gas, and they'll also use chlorine gas, and lovely things that burn your skin, burn your lungs, and can leave you permanently disabled if it doesn't kill you. So gas masks will be incredibly common, and of course, we've got to protect man's best friend. So we even had some for our dogs. Both sides also had a lot of horses at the beginning of the war. If you've watched any old movies or learned about any other military history, cavalry was very important, horseback. And there's always this idea, usually at the end, there's this cavalry charge that ends. Cavalry was very, 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 very important in many wars and will help win many, many battles. And both sides sort of kind of romanticize, many people romanticize this idea of war anyway. And cavalry was kind of the most romantic thing at the time. And so both sides had a bunch of horses and expected to, once they broke through the trenches, and they could ride their horses out and go into battle, because cars are still very new at this time. And tanks aren't invented until late into the war. And again, adding to the fact that this war is not very fun. Most of the horses just ended up getting eaten. Um, you also have submarines. As I mentioned, the British Navy is the most powerful and largest in the world at the time, and they will blockade German ports. The Germans cannot contend against Britain's superior navy, but they do have a new invention, which is the submarine, or as they call it, the U boat, which can travel under the water and hide from enemy ships. They are incredibly effective at sinking, especially unarmed ships, merchant ships, carrying supplies and resources, and that'll be one of their main ways they attack. And then, as I mentioned, we have the first tanks. These are nothing like modern tanks or tanks that we typically would think of. There's no giant gun or rotating thing. The tracks are huge and take up the entire thing. They're very, very slow. Um, they had a tendency to flip over, which is why that one has training wheels. They also only had armor on the sides, so they were weak to artillery and mortar fire, which is why they had to put a roof. Um, but also, they were not used like we use tanks now, or like they will be used in different wars. They are just kind of meant to go over the mines, go over the barbed wire, and they would typically just lead troops through no man's land. They were never really used in large numbers, and they kind of came too late to do anything that effective. As I said, we will have artillery. We're moved on from cannonballs, which you can fire a couple hundred feet, to now you're launching artillery miles and miles away. Like mustard gas, artillery was thought to be a way to weaken the enemy. And so both sides would fire artillery shells and mortars for hours and hours at both sides, hoping to weaken them and make it easy for them to take the trenches. Though they were not successful. This would lead to a condition known as shell shock, because you would just be, hiding in your trench, and you would just hear artillery shells going off, explosions, for hours on end, constantly until it literally made you go insane. Today, we call it similar condition PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder. Back then, they called it shell shock. Um, we also had the airplane invented just a decade earlier. It was by two brothers in North Carolina, the Wright brothers. It was made out of fabric and wood. Now we were beginning to make them out of both wood and metal, and let's fit a machine gun onto them. Why not? Uh, this is sort of the last refuge of gentlemanly warfare. At first, they did not have machine guns. It wasn't until the Lewis MK1 was first attached to planes in 1915 that you get the first aerial dogfights. At first, they're sort of just used for reconnaissance, so spying on your enemy. But eventually, we realized, oh wait, this guy's the enemy. They would just kind of fly around and wave at each other. But then they're like, oh no, I got to shoot this guy down. He's the enemy. And at a time where millions are dying down below in horribly bloody, nasty conditions, this is kind of like the last refuge where you have heroes, you have individual people that are able to do great things, um, to become national symbols. And most well known was Manfred von Richthofen, also known as the Red Baron, who was an ace. The best pilots were known as aces, and he will have 80 confirmed kills before he is eventually shot down and killed himself. And there were kind of unspoken rules. Like once somebody had been downed, you let them die. You didn't keep shooting them. You didn't keep chasing them. There were no parachutes. There were no escape. There was no escape ejection seats or anything. You were in a plane mostly made of wood and some fabric. And so if you were shot, you were going down. And that was it. And it was most of the time either just you and a gunner or just you. It was very, very different from obviously our airplanes today or even what they will be in World War II. Again, America is supposed to be neutral, but we're sending resources and guns and weapons and everything to the Allies. And the Germans are not happy about this. But all they can do is try to sink anything going to Britain. So, though the Germans could not counter Britain's navy outright, it turns out the Germans are actually much better at making ships, and they will sink one of Britain's greatest ships, simply because the German ships were just much stronger and had better weapons. They just could not counter the British Navy for its size, and so they will spend most of the war in port. But they will send out these U-boats to go and attack both British military, but most effectively to attack British civilian shipping. So these ships that were coming to Britain is of course an island nation, and so they need resources from around the world, especially their empire, but also, as I said, America, just sending them weapons and resources. And so they started sinking these ships. And there's this kind of fight in America. Do we want to, we don't want to get involved. We want to stay isolated. We want to remain in isolationism. Um, Obviously, there is a lot of support for Britain because they share a similar culture, and they've been a very close ally for the last um, nearly 100 years. There also is a large German population that wants to support the Germans. However, because of the blockade, we can only really trade with the Allies anyway. And what ends up kind of forcing our hand is what's known as unrestricted submarine warfare. So, Germany, which is desperate to starve Britain out because they're fighting a two front war, they can't get any resources from around the world. They've lost their empire, access to their empire, and they want to do the same thing. So they will declare the area around Britain and France a war zone and basically sink any ship that enters the area. And these can be military ships, they can be civilian ships, just bringing merchant ships, bringing trade and resources, but even like passenger ships, which before jet planes, the way that you could travel around the world is on passenger ships, passenger liners. And so they would sink, like they said, they would sink anything. And this is partially the fault of the British because the British were like, oh no, they're sinking our trade ships. We should smuggle resources in civilian ships because they won't kill civilians. Um, and then they also like to put guns onto ships that aren't supposed to have guns. And so originally the Germans would basically they would come out of the water with their submarine, tell the British ship, "Hey, surrender or we'll sink you with a torpedo," and then they would let them get onto a lifeboat and then sink the ship. But the British started hiding guns on the ship, and so when the U-boat would come out of the water, they would um, they would sink the U-boat before the U-boat could fire on them, and so the U-boats just started sinking everything. And then they started hiding guns and smuggling resources on passenger ships on these civilian liners. And but the ship that really challenged our neutrality was the sinking of the RMS Lusitania. This was probably one of the most famous ships um, on the sea at the time. One of the largest. It was part of a company known as Cunard Line with its sister ship, the Mauritania. These were the biggest and most luxurious passenger ships in the world. They were very, very fast as well. In fact, they could outrun a U boat, so they were generally considered safe anyway. They could carry thousands of passengers at a time and tons of cargo. And it was, as I said, the British were desperate because the Germans were seeking tons and tons of cargo from merchant ships, and they still needed these resources. And the Lusitania had been used as one of these smuggling ships, and it possibly even had deck guns on it. Um, and it was going to do one of its regular trips. It made trips back and forth from New York to Liverpool, England, you know, every week or so. And on May of 1915, uh, the Germans had decided that had discovered that it was being used for smuggling, and so they announced to the world that basically it was on its target list. They even took out ads in newspapers in New York City, where it was taking off from, that basically told Americans, "Do not get on the Lusitania. It has been marked for death and marked for sinking." But of course, oh, it's fast. It can outrun a U-boat, no problem. Well, for reasons unknown to us today, um, the Lusitania did make it across the Atlantic safely, but for some reason, on the morning of May 7th, it will slow down, basically almost come to a stop near the coast of Ireland, which is prime U boat hunting territory. And a U boat, the U 20, will spot the ship and fire a torpedo at it. Now, many of these ships were equipped with systems designed to basically try to stop sinking watertight compartments. And so the captain of the U-boat probably thought that it would just create a small hole in it or damage it or possibly not even hit it. But the ship wouldn't sink, it would just damage it. Um, but instead, what happened is when the torpedo hit the side of the ship, it exploded and created a massive hole in the side of the ship that caused the entire thing to sink in 18 minutes. Um, it's believed that the torpedo hit the coal storage area. At this time, these ships were all powered by steam engines, which are powered by coal, and so these ships would have had very large areas full with coal. And coal is, of course, flammable, but coal dust, which is left behind, is explosive. And so it's believed that it hit the coal where the coal was being had been stored, and of course it was out because they'd make it to the other side of the Atlantic. And that massive hole caused the ship to sink, basically roll over onto its side and sink. And because it was rolling over, these lifeboats and things that they could have used to possibly get off um, were basically unusable almost immediately. And so very, very few will make it off the ship. And ultimately, 1,195 people will die, including civilians and, of course, the crew. Um, for our sake, of course, the number we care about is the 124 Americans that died. And this will lead to basically global outcry from everybody. And basically Wilson says, if you do not stop this, we will join the war against you. And so this is one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. Well, definitely one of the largest civilian deaths of this period. And so they will stop because they do not want America to join this war because they're not able to win now. They're doing quite well against Russia, but they're not able to do anything against France, and both sides are just losing millions of people. But within just a year, they are already like desperate. They have to start doing unrestricted submarine warfare again, but they don't want the US involved. And so they have a plan. They think if they can distract America, that they can prevent them from being able to have an effect. They also had grossly underestimated the power of the American military, which is not surprising because unlike today, America did not have what we would consider a standing military. It only had a very small force. It wasn't until after World War II that America had a constant standing military. And Mexico was in the middle of its Mexican Revolution. We were uh, only, 70 years after we stole half their country. And we had just invaded them, chasing Pancho Villa and conquering Veracruz. So Mexico did not like us at all. And so they thought that we would be a natural, Mexico would be a natural ally against America. And so in January of 1917, the foreign minister of Germany, uh, Zimmerman, sent a telegram to his ambassador in Mexico and basically said, hey, go tell the Mexicans that if they declare war against the US, then they could get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. They believed that if Mexico went to war with America, this would delay them long enough for them to win the war in Europe. But unfortunately for Germany, the telegram was intercepted by the British, who immediately published it in American newspapers, sent it to the American president, and greatly angered the American people because we were already not happy with Germany and and this now showed that they were trying to conspire against us. You have cartoons going on in newspapers like this one where you have a glove with a knife carving up America with a German symbol on it. You have literally a German guy, you can tell because he had a pointy helmet, with devil horns and cloven hooves, offering tempting Mexico in the top cartoon. And it is with this and the resuming of unrestricted submarine warfare that we will ultimately end up joining the war. However, the year before that, 1916, was an election, and Wilson will run for re-election. He had intervened in Mexico and Latin America. He was talking about wanting the world to be safe for democracy and trade. And in 1916, his presidential slogan was, "He kept us out of the war," and he will win re-election. And then in early 1917, after he's inaugurated into his second term, he will ask Congress to declare war. You know, politicians are great at keeping promises. Um, so after the Zimmerman telegram is published and Germany announces in February of 1917 that um, it will resume its unrestricted submarine warfare, many Americans are already angry at these two things. Many are called for war. After resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, we will cut off diplomatic relations with Germany, basically recalling our ambassadors. And this is usually the step. Once diplomatic relations are broken down, usually the next step is war. And there's also a number of American ships sunk by Germans. And so on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson will ask Congress to declare war on Germany. And now we are finally, after 3 years, getting into the war, but it's going to take us a little while to actually get involved. In order to obviously fight the war, we need to build up our military. So, May of 1917, Wilson will sign the Selective Service Act, what's also known as the draft, in order to bring in men into the war to fight. Starts off ages 21 to 30, and then eventually is expanded from 18 to 45, because obviously we need men to go fight in the war. Ultimately, 24 million men will register for the draft. Uh, a million will make it to Europe. They have no experience, no training. The Europeans, which have been fighting this war for 3 years and um, suffering, called our soldiers doughboys because they were so green and so inexperienced. Their draft is also sometimes called conscription. It's been used, of course, many times throughout history, especially in the last several hundred years. It's quite common. Um, the Selective Service Act is still in the law today. So if you are a young man over the age of 18, you have 30 days to register for the draft. Although that is potentially changing as we may be entering into a period where we have automatic draft registration. But it is the law that you have to register, and if you don't, you lose access to money for college. You lose access to any federal jobs and any federal assistance. So it is important if you are a man over the age of 18 that you sign up for the draft. You can either do it when you renew your driver's license or by going to the Selective Service website. I've actually helped a student do that before. Uh, we haven't had to use the draft in 60 years. Fingers crossed. We don't have to use it again anytime soon. Um, One of the things that is sort of, I guess, nice about it is that uh, obviously all men includes African Americans and Mexican Americans. And despite the fact that they will be kept segregated, our military, just like a lot of our society at the time, is segregated. They will be paid the same as white conscripts, although they'll have white officers, and they will actually be kept out of combat. Funnily enough, in this war, so they'll be doing a lot of other jobs, support and building and that sort of stuff. But African Americans will be involved in this war, and they will help fight, um, although not on the front lines. But the African Americans will have a much bigger impact on the home front. Women. of course, will also be, they won't be drafted, but they will have a big part in helping with the war effort in this instance, because you have all these men that are now going into the army and going over to Europe to go fight. We need women to take their jobs. And so many women will take up the production of war materials and factories and jobs. Many see them as their patriotic duties. Others will join different groups. And others do this because they think that, hey, after we help out in this war, maybe we can gain equality. And it's actually one of the big reasons why after World War I, that women will the right for women will gain the right to vote. Also on the home front, America's advertising industry, which really took off during the early 20th century, will now be used to sell this war. And there's several different ways that you can sell this war. There's obviously posters. Is probably one of the main ways. Radio is becoming kind of big during this time period. You also have groups like the Boy Scouts and others, which will help push for war bonds and raise money and things like that. There's several different ways. Obviously, you can sign up to go fight. You can join different groups to gather resources and help raise funds for soldiers. Another way is victory gardens. Um, this idea that if you grow your own food, then you won't need to buy it from grocery stores, and then we can instead use that food to feed our soldiers. So, victory gardens are one way that people at home can help out the war. Another way is war bonds. Basically, the government is going to now start spending a lot of money because war is expensive. And instead of just putting all that debt onto the national credit card like we do today and paying that debt off, I don't know, never, currently sitting at 38 trillion, $39 trillion. If you buy war bonds, then basically you're giving the government your money and in order to help support the war effort, and then eventually you'll get it back with some interest. But this helps support the war effort and also prevent inflation. And all of these different posters are examples of propaganda. You have grow a victory garden to support the war effort, help us, defeat the mad German brute, enlist in war, don't waste food, buy war bonds. You have probably the most famous one of all time, I want you for the US Army. You have this one on the bottom right, buy government bonds, and it's targeted this old lady. Women help the war, like even old lady, even you can help out. Just give us some money because we got to go fight this war, and wars are expensive. Um, African Americans, as I said, will have a big, there'll be a big impact on this war effort. You have what's known as the Great Migration. In this instance, many African Americans will move north in search of economic opportunity. They want to take jobs in northern cities, again, left by the white men that have gone off to fight. Because again, at this point, most of the southern states are segregated, very racist. They have Jim Crow laws. Lynchings are still happening. And so by going up north, they are escaping racism, discrimination, and violence and having a better chance at life. As you can see from this map, the vast majority of these African Americans will go from places like Texas, Louisiana, Missouri, Alabama, Georgia, the Carolinas, up to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. These are our major industrial cities in the north, which causes some problems when all the white people return and go, why are all these black people living in my city now? Um, but again, they're going up there to get jobs and get away from racism and discrimination. And as happens in war sometimes, we begin to get very, very, very paranoid about spies. So we first passed the Espionage Act. Um, Again, it has SPI or spy in it. This basically makes it illegal for anybody to spy on or hurt the war effort, which is intentionally vague. A lot of people will be, just for speaking out against the war or doing anything at all that might be considered detrimental to the war effort could be arrested. Our old friend Eugene V. Debs will be arrested um, and put in jail. He actually runs for president from prison um, and gets 1 million votes. This is actually probably his most successful election is from while he was in prison um, because he was telling people not to sign up for the draft. There'll be a number of socialists that are targeted for the same reason. There's a lot of criticism, of course, of this. This literally is a violation of our First Amendment rights, and we signed another law, May in 1918, called the Sedition Act, which makes it a crime to speak or publish considered disloyal or abusive uh, while the country is at war. It will be repealed. The Espionage Act, though, is still law, and we have executed a couple of Americans under the Espionage Act, and it is still considered the law of the land. Um, so again, yeah, you have this. I pledge allegiance in silence about the war. Quiet, know your place, and shut your face. These are real. These are real. Propaganda posters from this period. This cartoon up at the top is literally showing a guy, an arm ripping out Liberty's torch of freedom um, with the name with the word espionage bill written on it. This idea, because of course it does violate our First Amendment, and can be considered uh, violating our freedoms. One person who actually takes this all the way to the Supreme Court is a Socialist Party leader named Charles Schenck, who is convicted of violating the Espionage Act for telling men to not sign up for the draft, and he is arrested, and he ends up obviously suing, claiming that it violates his First Amendment rights, and it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, who ends up upholding his conviction. The Supreme Court, the head Supreme Court justice at the time, is Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he, in his decision, writes that the First Amendment doesn't protect dangerous speech. And so, in this instance, because we are at war, telling people not to go for the draft is detrimental to the war effort. And so, another example that he gives is like yelling fire in a crowded theater, because if you did that, then it would cause a panic and people could die or get hurt. Another example would be today, like you can't say bomb in an airport because that could cause a panic or make people think that there's a terrorist attack or that there's a bomb or something like that. So that's not considered protected speech. Terroristic threats. There's unfortunately a lot of news stories out there about students threatening to shoot up their schools. If you threaten the life of the president, you will have Secret Service show up at your door. That's also considered dangerous speech. So this is one of those court cases out there that sort of defined a limit to free speech, because even though we do have that as a First Amendment, not everything is protected speech. So you have another propaganda poster here. Free speech doesn't mean careless talk. You never know who might be listening. In Europe, as I said, are affectionately called doughboys. Don't have a whole lot of experience. The American Expeditionary Force, AEF, will have 1 million soldiers by the end of the war, although we only participate in a couple of battles. In one of those battles, Corporal Alvin York will lead 7 men to capture a German machine gun nest and take 120 soldiers prisoner, and he will be awarded the Medal of Honor at the Battle of the Argonne Forest, which is one of the two main battles that we fought in. And uh, even though we don't participate in more than a couple battles, and we kind of show up at the end, um, it's almost like us being there kind of like reinvigorated the Allies who had been dying and fighting and losing millions in this war, while their generals just kept sending more and more of them to die. There were mutinies in the French army. They It's nearly a quarter of the British generation will be killed or wounded. Um, there is not a village or town in Great Britain that does not have some sort of statue to a World War I soldier who was lost. This war was just completely devastating to Europeans, to the young men of this generation. And when the Americans arrived, it was sort of for the British and French, like, oh my God, we have help. The Americans are here, and they're finally helping. And the Germans at that point just kind of went, we're done. We don't want to fight anymore. We didn't even actually invade Germany. The Germans surrendered before our forces even made it into Germany. They overthrew Kaiser Wilhelm, their leader, and created a democracy and then sued for peace. In fact, not only did we not fight in many battles, we didn't lose very many soldiers to combat. What actually killed more American soldiers than combat was the flu. Um, when you have a lot of people, one of the things that in many wars recently that has killed a lot of people is disease. And in this instance, you have an outbreak of the flu or influenza in Europe, which will spread among the different armies and, of course, eventually back to civilian populations. It'll ultimately kill anywhere from 25 to 50 million people over the next 2 years. It is called the Spanish flu by some, even though it did not start in Spain and Spain was not involved in the war. So, don't know why it's called the Spanish flu. Um, but one of the allies ends up suffering even more than the British and French. As I said, the British and French are losing millions of soldiers, but it is nothing compared to what the Russians are losing. They turn out to be absolutely slaughtered by the Germans, despite the fact that Germans concentrate their main force in France in order to fight against the French and British over there on the Western Front. They end up conquering massive, massive swathes of Russian territory. The Russians are just completely inept and unable to fight despite having a massive numerical advantage in terms of soldiers having a lot larger population. You also have massive famine. People are starving in Russia. And so they turn to somebody who promises to make it better. So now we have to kind of pause the war talk to do a little bit of political science. Um, you might have learned about this in previous classes. And of course, this is something that in America is talked about a lot, especially during after the Cold War and during the Cold War, which we'll talk about later. Uh, Communism. This is going to be a really, really big thing in the 20th century. It is an ideal, a government. It's both a government and an economy. It's sort of kind of mixing together. It was ultimately created by a man named Karl Marx, with the help of a wealthy business leader that supported him called Friedrich Engels. He writes the Communist Manifesto in 1848. He is in Germany, and he basically looks at this new industrial society after the Industrial Revolution and how we have gone from workers, living their lives and working, and they would never be rich. They would not necessarily do necessarily that well. But now life was so incredibly horrible, so incredibly monotonous. The jobs were bad, and all the wealth was going to the people at the top. So he thought that the working class, who he called the proletariat, should overthrow the factory owners, or he called the bourgeoisie, which is a French word. Um, why he's German and using French words, I don't know. And so Marx believed that when the proletariat overthrew the bourgeoisie, they could create a moneyless, classless, stateless society after redistributing all the wealth. And so even though he originally believed that this would take place in an industrial economy, a country with an industrial economy like maybe Britain or Germany or the UK, Great Britain, it actually ends up first happening in Russia. As I said, Russia was completely um, taking the brunt of this war, losing millions of people, both civilian and soldiers. The leader of Russia at the time was Tsar Nicholas II. Fun fact: he is the cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and of King George in Great Britain. They are all the grandchildren of Queen Victoria. And if you ever look at a picture of Tsar Nicholas II and King George, you would be hard to tell which one was which because they were looked so much alike. And he was the latest of the Romanov dynasty in Russia. And he decided after his generals were losing against the Germans, I'm going to take over the war. And it got even worse because he had no idea what he was doing. And it led to even worse disaster. There's massive food rationing, people are starving, and eventually the people rebel in what's known as the February Revolution and overthrow him. He is forced to abdicate his position and the Romanov dynasty, and a new socialist government takes over. But this provisional government is convinced by France and Britain and the Allies to keep fighting, to not end the war, basically by giving them a lot of money. And obviously, the Russian people are still suffering and not happy about that. So, in October of 1917, a more radical faction, not the Socialist Party, but a communist party, known as the Bolsheviks, led by the man that you've seen now a couple times, Vladimir Lenin. He will launch what's known as the October Revolution to overthrow the more moderate socialist. And he gains the support of the masses by promising them three things: peace, land, and bread. And at this point, they are a bunch of landless, starving, war weary peasants. And boy, does that sound good. Pretty much immediately, the Bolsheviks are able to take control of the country, of the main part of the country, and the capital. They are very quickly able to overthrow the socialist government under Kerensky, and then they capture Nicholas and pretty much immediately sue for peace. He keeps his word. Germany will force the Russians to give up a massive amount of territory with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, but it gets Russia out of the war. It gets them peace. But unfortunately, for the Russians, the fighting, even though they're not fighting in the war anymore, there will be a Russian civil war that will last for several years, even beyond the end of World War One. But ultimately, the Red Army will end up winning. Lenin leads through a sort of he takes Marxism and kind of adds his own spin on it, and Marxist Leninism is this idea of creating. It's a communist government. You have um, kind of like a political party, kind of like a Democratic Party or Republican Party. You have the Communist Party, but there's only one party, and the head of that party is also the head of the government. And you have the ultimate socialism, where you have government taking control of the entire economy, a dictatorship of the proletariat designed to redistribute the wealth and make everybody equal. Um, Today, there are countries still ruling through Marxist Leninism models, places like China, Cuba, and Vietnam, which will continue Marxist Leninist ideals and then kind of put their own spin on it, especially China, which we'll talk about during the Cold War. And this will be kind of the guiding rules for all communist countries for the rest of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. Um, back in America, Wilson is like, okay, well, the war is winding down, and now I'm going to uh, basically create an idea for peace, and he calls it his 14 points. He's very idealistic. And so he comes up with, the thing he's been talking about: make the world safe for democracy, let people choose, let's get rid of empires, let's have free trade, let's get rid of our weapons, and let's disarm, and let's all be happy and sing kumbaya. And nobody listened. Um, he will be ultimately ignored by Britain and France and the other allies. Um, Ultimately, Germany will sue for peace after overthrowing Kaiser Wilhelm. However, one of his 14 points they will listen to, and that is creating a general association of nations to preserve world peace, and that will create the League of Nations, which is supposed to solve the differences that eventually led to the war. Germany will ultimately agree to peace, and they want Wilson's 14 points. It sounds really good for them, but not to Britain and France. And so they will end up signing the armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, or November 11th, 1918, which is celebrated throughout the world as Armistice Day, the end of the war. In America, we celebrate it as Veterans Day. But as I said, Britain and France are not interested in this peaceful coexistence happiness. They want to punish Germany for this war, who wasn't even the one that started the war. The country that started the war was Austria Hungary and Russia. They're not being punished as bad. Um, so, but because Germany had inflicted the most damage and was certainly the richest and most powerful country involved on the bad side, they will receive the majority of the punishment. So, the treaty that actually ends the war, because you can have a ceasefire, which is or an armistice, but the treaty is what basically officially ends the war. And so this is signed at the Treaty of Versailles, at the Palace of Versailles, in the village of Versailles outside of Paris. In it, the British and French, as I said, basically ignore Wilson and what the Germans want and do what they want, which is carve up Germany, force them to have a bunch of limits on their military and to just generally disarm. They have to accept ultimate responsibility for the war, even though they didn't start it. They have to pay billions of dollars in reparations that will ultimately destroy their economy. And they end up losing about 13% of their territory and 10% of their population. France gets Alsace-Lorraine back, but also they reconstitute the nation of Poland, which had been conquered by Germany and Russia and Austria-Hungary and kind of gobbled up by them. And they take away part of Prussia to give them access to a trade port in Danzig, which is again a Prussian city. And it is such a huge embarrassment and anger to the Germans that they will eventually turn to a guy with a funny mustache to make them uh, feel better about themselves and make Germany um, great again. So they will also break up Austria-Hungary into a bunch of different nations, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others. And the Ottoman Empire will also be broken up into the modern day Republic of Turkey. The rest of it will be divided up among the Allies, including the Levant, which will be taken over by Britain, as Palestine, Syria, and Iraq will also become part of the British and French empires, along with all of Germany's other colonies. And so this is great, supposedly for Britain and France, but Italy, even though they were their ally, although not a very good ally, as I mentioned at the beginning, um, they won't get anything out of it, and so they're going to be very angry about this. The Germans are very angry about this, and they virtually ignore every one of Wilson's requests except for one, which is the League of Nations. They will create a League of Nations designed to maintain world peace and prevent another such war, which is why this is called the only war. And we didn't need to have a second one because the League of Nations worked. I'm just kidding. It did not keep world peace, which is why this is called World War One. Again, spoiler. As I said, in Russia, the war will continue, even though they have left World War One and World War One has officially ended. There is the Russian Civil War that will last all the way until October of 22. So this is 4 years nearly after the end of World War One, and that's because you have the Reds, the communists, who are um, under Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, fighting against the monarchists, the whites. And the White Army is not only a bunch of right leaning and monarchist supporters, anti Bolshevik groups, they also get a lot of support from Western nations who do not want communism to spread. And they certainly don't want Russia to become communist. So you have British, French, and American soldiers being sent over to fight against the Russians, their former allies, after the war. But ultimately, they end up withdrawing by 1920, and the Bolsheviks control the majority of the industry in Moscow and the important cities. So ultimately, they are successful over the white movement. The goal of the white movement was to, of course, restore the Tsar and the Romanov dynasty. But the chances of that were ended in July 1918 when the Tsar and his family were taken to the basement of the house they were in and shot. To avoid them being captured by the White Army. Um, well, that's fun. Unfortunately, despite any rumors or stories and or cartoons, none of them survived. Although there is a story that because they sewed their jewelry into their dresses, they did survive the initial. A couple of the girls survived the initial volleys and had to be bayoneted after watching their family die in front of them. Isn't history fun? Ultimately, the Red Army will end up defeating the last of the white forces in 1922. Ultimately, there's between 17 and 12 million casualties in the Russian Civil War, but the Bolsheviks have won, the communists have won, and now Russia will be reformed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, or as it's more commonly known, the Soviet Union. So this is the world's first communist country. Vladimir Lenin is its leader, although not for very long because he dies shortly after. As I said, the Ottoman Empire becomes Turkey. You have a bunch of new nations being created. Like I said, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland is brought back from the dead. Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are all created. And then the British and French carve up the Middle East, completely ignoring tribes, rivalries, other nations, and claims. Um, you might be able to tell if you are any at all familiar with a map that these lines, these random straight lines that they drew after World War One, still make up the borders of many of these former nations. Syria, as it is on the map, is still what Syria looks like today. The British Mandate of Mesopotamia is modern day Iraq. Saudi Arabia and Iran are now independent. The British Mandate of Palestine is now the modern countries of Jordan and Israel and Palestine. And then, as I said, Turkey becomes the Republic of Turkey becomes kind of the center, the old center of the Ottoman Empire. And so you have nine new countries in Europe and a bunch of random lines and crazy stuff done in the Middle East, which I'm sure will not come back to bite us or cause us any problems in the future. Um, but with this new post-war world and this new organization that we created, that America created, that our president suggested, we don't even join it. Um, Part of the United States Constitution requires that the United States Senate, the upper house of our Congress, has to approve all treaties. And so the leader of the Senate at the time, a Republican under the name of Henry Cabot Lodge, basically works to undermine Wilson's League of Nations and ultimately gets the Senate to reject the Treaty of Versailles. We actually have to sign a different treaty with Germany. And ultimately, the League of Nations is created, but it is not successful. And as you can see, kind of from these from these cartoons, you have this idea that the League of Nations could eventually lead the U.S. into war. It could violate our sovereignty. You have Woodrow Wilson laying an egg, blowing a bubble of idealism, and then you have the League of Nations bridge, and the keystone that's missing is the U.S. Ultimately, it will last until 1940 when, of course, it collapses after the start of World War II. And U.S. will return to our previous stance of isolationism and non-involvement in world affairs as we just kind of do our own thing for the 1920s. And I'm sure nothing bad will happen because of that. However, as a part of our return to isolation, there is this rising fear in America known as the first Red Scare. And again, it's the first because it's not our only Red Scare. This is also when you should generally, is in the 20th century, associate anything, the color red, or calling somebody red as being associated with communism. After the success of the communist revolution in Russia, there is a fear all throughout Europe and America that now communists are going to come over here and overthrow our wonderful capitalist empire and democracy. And one of the main ways that this appears is in anti-union and anti-immigrant feelings. I know America being anti-immigrant, so weird. Um, Also attacking leftist groups, because I mean, it's not illegal to be a communist. It's not illegal to be a socialist or um, be any part of a leftist group. But during this time, especially if you were an immigrant, it didn't take a lot for the government to sort of, suspect you, arrest you, and especially if you are an immigrant, or as you were referred to back then as an alien, for you to be deported. And one of the things that does sort of kick this into higher gear is a attempted bombing of the Attorney General's house, the AG Palmer. He his house is attacked by anarchists, and so he will go on a massive raid of anarchists, suspected anarchists, and groups and people, and deport them back to their home countries, which is typically Europe. And so you have a lot of cartoons like this one, where you literally have Uncle Sam kicking an alien red back to where he came from. You have cartoons like this one where it's accusing labor organizers and unions of leading from strikes to disorder, riots to Bolshevism, which is again that's the party of Russia, and communism to eventually chaos and God knows what. And ultimately, in addition to an increase in deportation of suspected Reds and anarchist, communist, socialist, labor organizers, that sort of thing. There's also even two immigrants that are ultimately executed for a murder they did not commit. Sacco and Vanzetti, basically two Italian men who were near a crime or were in the location where a crime happened, were spotted by a policeman and arrested, put on trial, and found guilty and executed, even though it's quite obvious to us today that there was no real evidence and they absolutely were innocent. So again, Americans were so scared of communism and so afraid of immigrants, especially, that we were willing to, you know, execute people who were innocent and even restrict our own freedom, which is, again, not the first or only time in our history that we have done this. There's, of course, there is this Red Scare. There's also going to be another Red Scare in the 1950s after World War II. And then we also have similar debates going on even today following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So this is nothing new for America. Deportations of aliens that we don't like, anti immigrant feelings, and debates over how should we level security and sense of ease and peace and order with our own freedoms. So that is the end of this chapter and module 3 for History 1302. Um, thank you and have a good day.